All right, so welcome back, everybody, to our second panel of the day. This is an independent panel on activism and advocacy. We do have a very packed panel with several presenters. One of our presentations will be recorded, although the presenters, Jessica Greenebaum and Liz Cherry, are present. It is a horrible 5:30 in the morning for them, so they thought it very, very smartly thought they would record instead and just be around for questions. So if we could please try to keep our presentations to between 10 and 12 minutes. We do have a lot of wiggle room at the end for questions. If you'd like to leave your questions in the chat, me and Mishka will write those down and get those to the presenters at the end of the 4 presentations. So Nick, you want to get us started?
Yep, sure. I will share first. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along, and thanks to Zoe and Corey and all the other organizers for putting this on, putting this conference on 2 years in a row, which is, I think, a really great effort during the pandemic. I know a bunch of organizations, including ones that I've been in, have really lost momentum throughout the pandemic. So it's really, really great effort. And I think even looking ahead post the pandemic, I think having all this technology set up and the way to do things internationally in a low cost way is really good in terms of accessibility, low cost, environmental impact that we can do the conference this way. So thanks to the organizers. I can't take any credit for it, but I'm very happy to be a participant this year. So I'm going to be talking about incorporating a structural approach into animal advocacy, which is something I've been thinking about the last few years and something I spoke about at the conference last year. And last year, I guess I spoke about this idea of the way in which we frame animal exploitation within the animal movement. Generally, we often put it purely at the fault of individuals. Individual consumers are just consuming the wrong products within the free market, and that's sort of the level of analysis at times within the movement. And so I tried to bring in some other ideas of, looking at the role of companies that exploit other animals, looking at the role of governments in facilitating that, and looking a bit broader into this issue beyond just individual blame for animal exploitation. So in my talk today, I'm more going to go through some of the ways we can incorporate these ideas into animal advocacy. But I guess for those who didn't see my talk last year, and I guess just to reiterate some of these ideas, I wanted to sort of cover that sort of similar idea, but in a bit of a different way. So I wanted to do this with an analogy to the COVID-19 pandemic, thinking about individual and structural responses to it, and how we can think about that as an analogy for animal activism as well, particularly as a book series sort of coming out of this conference, hopefully next year sometime, has that pandemic as the kind of focus or starting point to talk about some of these issues. And also this conference specifically, we're talking about or it's sort of based on C. Wright Mill's idea of the structural links and individual biography, that link between public issues and private lives, and that connection between the individual and the society. So I guess what made me think about this is I was thinking at one point when thinking about this idea of individual change, structural change, et cetera, in the context of COVID and trying to stop the spread of COVID, I was thinking if you live in a place that has achieved elimination of the virus, there's no elimination, there's no COVID in the state that you're in, for example, which I've been lucky enough to be in at various times throughout the pandemic. If there've actually been no COVID within the state I'm in Victoria here in Australia. Also, we've been the city of Melbourne, we've been the longest in lockdown throughout the pandemic, so not so lucky in other ways. But in times like that, it really doesn't matter what you do on the individual level. You can be, partying with people, people all around you. You can be not sanitizing your hands, etc. Of course, it's important to do all those things in case there's cases that are undetected, etc. But I guess thinking about these individual and structural responses to COVID, if we purely focus on these individual actions of just social distancing on the individual level, sanitizing our hands, those kind of things, we would really we wouldn't be giving a full picture of the issue. We wouldn't be necessarily addressing it in all the different ways that we could. So this is part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. There's also these structural solutions in terms of thinking about how do we effectively quarantine people coming into the country, vaccination rollout at the government level, etc. Of course, when we're talking about that connection between the individual and society as sociologists, to first year students, that kind of thing, we often talk about them as some kind of dichotomy of the structures of society and the individual agency. But as we develop, it sort of becomes more nuanced and we see the connection between those things. So there is the vaccination rollout from the government, for example, but also individuals' willingness to get vaccination also affects how effective that rollout is. Individuals can sanitize their hands, but it's also about like governments and businesses and that kind of thing providing those kind of services. So again, both of those things are important, but I guess again, with that analogy to animal activism, if we just focused on these individual solutions to stopping COVID, we're missing part of the picture. And again, the same could be argued for animal advocacy. And there has been a lot of work within this space over the last few years of activists kind of taking these ideas on board. So it's not just something within sociology, which tends to have this structural place. Even though we emphasize individual agency as well, we often have this focus on the structures, which is often lacking in the animal movement. But yeah, this activism, particularly over the last few years, is really starting to take place within the movement. Just a few examples of that are the Plant-Based Treaty, which is a global treaty, which is looking to be in conjunction with things like the Paris Agreement, to try and halt the environmental harm caused by animal agriculture. And they've spoken about a transition from animal-based food systems to plant-based food systems. So looking at that system level, not just at the individual level. And there's all kinds of sort of individual steps within that as well, which I've seen here in Australia, where I am. The Animal Justice Party, for example, has proposed a tax on meat and dairy, for example, which is an interesting kind of way of looking at that, of actually changing the incentives within the food system rather than just encouraging people to choose vegan options within the existing food system. Another example is in Canada, which is Nation Rising, and they're aiming to shift government subsidies away from animal agriculture and towards the creation of a plant-based food system. And one of their initiatives is an open letter sent to ministers in Canada around agriculture and environment, and encouraging that shift towards a plant-based food system, primarily around health grounds in terms of stopping the spread of further pandemics. But also bringing animal environmental issues as well. So again, it's sort of a unique way to address this issue, a bit of a different way to how we've often done things within the movement before. And finally, an example I'm probably most familiar with is Animal Rebellion. And they're based in the UK, and they've for the last few years had this, or since they were created, have had this message of a plant-based food system. And they've sort of looked at that structural end of things, of actually looking at the supply side of things, looking at companies, for example. So they blockaded a McDonald's, encouraging McDonald's to go plant-based, totally plant-based by 2025. And they've had similar campaigns around dairy companies as well. So again, rather than sort of leaving the companies to do what they want, and individuals choosing vegan, they're actually trying to shift that supply, I guess, shift that at the production level, and trying to get these companies and governments to do different things rather than relying on change at the individual level. I guess another thing I want to avoid doing here is putting down vegan advocacy. I do think vegan advocacy is important, and it's certainly the main activism I've done as an animal activist in the past. And I don't at all regret that. I think it definitely has a place in the movement. I would perhaps argue, in terms of my developing thinking in these last few years, of perhaps we put too much emphasis on that at the expense of other things. But I think even when we do promote vegan outreach, encouraging people to go vegan, we can still do that in a way that does incorporate these structural ideas and learn ideas from sociology, learn ideas from other social movements about ways we can do this. So I'm just going to finish with a little, I guess, case study of a campaign and thinking about how we can reframe our messages to account for that fact that animal exploitation isn't just a result of individual choices, but there's other things going on, animal industries, etc. So I mentioned earlier on within the animal movement, our messaging is often very individual focused. And so in this anti-dairy campaign that I was a part of here in Melbourne, Australia, the messaging is very much putting the blame on individuals. He died for your yogurt with a picture of a cow, or he was killed because you wanted cheese. And so the idea, these are animals being killed because you're purchasing the wrong product. So the problem is framed as the individual, and the solution is also framed as the individual. There's no sort of analysis of industries, governments, these broader factors at play. So thinking about what we can learn, again, from sociological theory and bringing in these structures, and also from other social movements as well. Certainly other social movements often aren't as focused on individual change as the animal movement, but they definitely do have aspects of individual change. One example is in the environmental movement of encouraging people to switch banks due to fossil fuels. Another example is the BDS movement, encouraging people to support justice for Palestine in terms of the products they buy. An individual boycott, kind of similar to veganism, or kind of a similar strategy to veganism. But these campaigns, even though they are promoting individual change, they're not so much putting the blame on individuals. So it's these banks are doing a bad thing, you can stop that, or this government is doing a bad thing, you can do something about it at the individual level. So the problem is framed as companies and governments, and the solution is individual, which I think can be more positive. It can be perhaps more inviting in terms of people taking part in these campaigns. So just one example of thinking about this anti-dairy campaign, thinking about how we can frame, even when we are pursuing individual change, thinking about pursuing that the problem as companies and governments, the problem is structural and the solution is individual, rather than just, the problem and the solution being individual. And I'm definitely not a good ad guy, or very good at coming with catchy things, but something like the dairy industry kills cows, boycott this slaughter industry. So it's this industry is doing this harm, and you can stop it by doing that boycott at the individual level. So thinking about how we can bring in some of these ideas into our framing of our messages when it comes to individual change. I'm hoping to write about some of these ideas in a chapter for the upcoming book, Human-Animal Relationships in Times of Pandemic and Climate Crises, Multi-Species Sociology for the New Normal. I believe that the plan is to have that out sometime in 2022. So whether I'm a part of that or not, I'm sure that'll be well worth checking out. So keep your eye out for that. You can also, if you're interested in any of my work, my email, my Twitter, etc., on the website, theconversation.com. I've got links to all of my publications. And also over the last few years, I've been developing these ideas, thinking about these ideas in conjunction with other academics, such as Corey, who's here today, Corey Wren, and also, activists as well on the radio show I'm one of the hosts of, which is Freedom of Species. You can find it 3cr.org.au/freedom of species. I've been developing those ideas with Harley McDonald Eckersall from Animal Rebellion as well. And she is both very active with Animal Rebellion and also a regular Freedom of Species contributor as well. So yeah, I will leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Nick. I'm stuck under the dog now. Thank you for the kind words about the conference and the organization. And we're so honored to have you this year, right, Mishka? Donelle, you want to go ahead and share your screen? Oh, sleepy puppy.
Thank you. And you can hear me? Can hear me? Thank you. Firstly, thank you to the conference organisers for putting this conference on. And also, I just wanted to say it's such a pleasure to be here with my fellow panellists. So in this research, veganism is viewed as a way of living that involves a commitment to eschewing exploitation and the avoidance of contributing to unnecessary suffering. It's a political, radical and subversive means to reproach and reject the ubiquitous systemic use, abuse and exploitation of non-human animals, humans and the environment. And today this occurs within the economic system of capitalism. The veterinary profession today is a coordinated and formally recognised group of individuals primarily involved in tending to the health and well-being of non-human animals. The profession plays a role in society that extends beyond providing medical care to non-human animals, and it's also comprehensively involved in public and environmental health. It promotes animal welfare, meaning that the profession supports humans' use and consumption of other animals, so long as those animals are so-called treated well. It's a profession enmeshed in all facets of the vast animal industrial complex. And so vegan ideology and the values and practices common to the veterinary profession seem at odds. And so this thesis, so this is a presentation giving an overview of my recently submitted PhD thesis. And the thesis explored if and how vegan veterinary professionals, hereafter called VVPs, are affected by this apparent irreconcilability between their beliefs, values and practices of veganism and those of the veterinary profession, and how they negotiate challenges they encounter in performing their professional role. So it set out to answer the following key research questions. So how are veterinary professionals in England who identify as vegan affected in small animal veterinary practice as a result of their veganism? And what aspects of their role in small animal veterinary practice pose challenges for them as vegans and veterinary professionals? Second research question, how do veterinary professionals in England who identify as vegan negotiate the apparent irreconcilability between veganism and veterinary practice? And what strategies did they employ to negotiate the challenges they encounter in small animal veterinary practice as vegans and veterinary professionals? I just want to say it is recognised here that vegans aren't homogenous, nor are they, to cite Laura Wright, a unified group in possession of a cohesive ideological mandate. And it's acknowledged that there isn't one universally agreed upon way to define veganism or be vegan or to practice veganism. However, as I said, veganism here is viewed as aligning with animal liberation, and the term vegan refers to ethically and politically motivated individuals. And vegans whose actions and beliefs align with the original political radical concept of veganism, arguably those whose lives are most affected by being vegan. So for this reason, vegans whose commitment to veganism is primarily, although not necessarily exclusively, motivated by concern for animals were the focus of this research. So interviews were conducted with 20 VVPs comprising veterinary surgeons and registered veterinary nurses throughout England. Participants were recruited using Facebook through purposive sampling, so via direct email to individuals, and through canvassing veterinary practices by email. And using snowball sampling method. Telephone, video call and in-person methods were used for conducting interviews and collecting the data. They were transcribed and coded by me using thematic analysis. And this research is situated within a critical animal studies framework. The three key themes emerged. The focus of chapter 1 is power, because in speaking with VVPs, they identified things like the breeding of animals as companions, the use of animals for producing and testing pharmaceuticals, and the killing of healthy or helpable animals as especially challenging for them. The second empirical chapter explored how the normality and ubiquity of meat and other animal products in small animal veterinary practice is challenging for VVPs. They also frequently mentioned encountering unsatisfactory plant-based catering, and they were uncomfortable about using and promoting meat-based pet food. They also often struggled with feeding meat to hospitalised patients. Chapter 3 focuses on culture. So opposing ideologies converge in small animal veterinary practice where vegans are employed, and VVPs expressed feeling challenged when encountering speciesism, the meat paradox, cognitive dissonance, in the workplace, and many felt perplexed by paradoxical views and treatment of different animals in veterinary practice. But on the other hand, some were less surprised by the prevalence of meat culture in the veterinary profession, and basically saw the profession as a microcosm reflecting the paradoxical attitudes towards non-human animals in wider society. But to give just a fragment sample of the data and findings, here are some quotations about breeding from the Power chapter. I'll give you just a moment to look over those. So all participants disliked breeding, although their reasons for this varied and were often compound. A common reason for this disapproval was the excess in unwanted animals who they saw as languishing in shelters. And they also saw selective breeding as a welfare issue. And they saw breeding of companion animals, often selective breeding for pedigrees, as a reflection of poor societal attitudes about animals. I'll just give you a moment to look through those quotes. So the strategies that VVPs employ in small animal veterinary practice to negotiate the discomfort experience when encountering these aspects of the role were identified. So there were many. Just as an overview, they moderate their behaviour to remain polite, maintain professionalism, and to foster positive workplace relationships. They will self-censor, and they feel sometimes unable to express how they feel about certain practices that they disagree with or find objectionable. They may defer tasks that are difficult for them to colleagues, or they may set boundaries by establishing with colleagues or employers certain things that they are not wanting or willing to do. And some of these strategies are reflected in these quotes. So here are some quotations from the consumption chapter. Just a moment, look through those. The lunch workroom is a site where veganism and carnism intersect. Thus, it also exemplifies a location where, to quote Richard Twine, morally divergent eating practices and effective attachment, close quote, exist. Vegans may encounter problems eating with non-vegans in any professional setting, but what makes VVP's circumstances unique is that they're working in the veterinary profession, and the food ingested by their non-vegan co-workers may be of the same species as those presented to them as patients. Many VVPs express having an aversion to meat, and this was evident in their mention of the lunchroom as a site of discomfort. VVPs also mentioned encountering a lack of provision or inadequate provision of food for them at catered workplace events. And VVPs often found it difficult to promote and use meat-based pet food in veterinary practice, even though there were mixed opinions about plant-based pet foods as an alternative. Just a moment to look through those quotes. The various strategies that VVPs use to negotiate discomfort stemming from others' consumption of animals in the veterinary setting include boundary maintenance, so as to avoid being around colleagues if animals are being eaten. Inadequate food provision for vegans was an issue often raised, with self-catering emerging as a strategy. So VVPs could ensure that they had suitable, sufficient food and drink while at work and workplace events. With promoting and using meat-based pet food, they negotiated this discomfort by prioritising their patient, altering their mindset, stepping back, employing cognitive dissonance, expressing resignation and accepting the status quo. citing a lack of options and emphasising, again, the need for professionalism. So here are some quotations from the Cult chapter. So as mentioned before, looking at veganism in the veterinary profession is unique because it's the only profession dedicated to animal welfare and well-being, while deeply enmeshed in the animal industrial complex through its involvement with various capitalistic institutionalized forms of non-human and often human exploitation. These forms of consumption, so animals as food and entertainment, or entertainment, are normative within the realm of Western culture and within the veterinary industry, but they're not normal when viewed through a vegan lens. Annie Potts uses the term meat culture to describe, quote, all the tangible and practical forms through which the ideology of carnism is expressed and lived, close quote. EVP's perceptions of the environment in which they work as being imbued in meat culture were evident, and they were aware of and affected by observing speciesism, cognitive dissonance, and the meat paradox in their workplaces and the veterinary profession more broadly. I had a lot to say about this, so the quotes are quite large. The VVPs use various strategies when encountering what we might call these psychocultural mechanisms in the workplace, and they moderate their behaviour and self-censor when with colleagues to avoid causing discomfort or conflict. They're aware of negative vegan stereotypes, which they encounter in the veterinary setting, and they anticipated vegan stigma, which was negotiated using strategies such as self-censorship and impression management when around others. Many VVPs observed veganism and activism as negatively perceived within the profession. Nevertheless, when it came to animal use for exhibition or entertainment, for example, zoos and animal races, VVPs often subverted these practices by refusing to participate in them and speaking out, or being what Richard Twine, drawing on the work of Sarah Ahmed, would call being vegan killjoys. So just very quickly at the end, this research has implications on 3 levels. If veganism continues to grow in popularity and prevalence, the implications of veganism for professions, including the veterinary profession, will increasingly become an important area of social inquiry. It's not currently known how many vegans work as veterinary professionals, but since the veterinary profession appeals to individuals who care about animals, it may be a profession that appeals to vegans despite its moral contradictions. It's therefore an apt profession for a study exploring key barriers, personal, social, and professional, that vegans face daily, barriers that this research might help to alleviate. It also has implications for the veterinary profession, this research. So the potential of vegan influence becomes particularly poignant when considering that presently there is a sense that the veterinary profession is undergoing transition. It's at a turning point. And some prominent changes currently occurring within the veterinary sector relate to the feminisation of the profession, corporatisation, and attention to promoting equality and diversity and sustainability. So when considering these changes that are taking place, research on the experiences of VVPs working in small animal veterinary practice proves timely. And at the time when this thesis was being written, anthropogenic climate change threatens ecosystems, the existence of innumerable non-human animal species, the health of the planet, and potentially the longevity of human beings as a species. Of course, we're living through COVID-19, whose origin, while apparently unknown, is undoubtedly anthropogenic and related to human relationships with other animal species. Yet, we're not really talking about these adequately in terms of those ways advanced by Paula Arcari, who argues for a holistic recognition, re-evaluation, and end to how humans commodify, use, and exploit non-human animals within the global animal industrial complex. So studies on vegans and veganism and the veterinary profession are highly relevant considering these serious contemporary global issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Donelle. That was a little bit to be expected, the results there. That's interesting to get a glimpse into that world, because I know many of us probably as kids thought about being veterinarians, and then when we learned the reality of what you'd have to put up with to do that, certainly really off-putting. So yeah, if anybody has questions for Donelle, please put them in the chat. We'll come back to her at the end of the panel. At this time, I am going to push play on a pre-recorded talk from Jessica and Liz, and they'll be available in the chat as well. So let me see if I can do this without messing it up. Bear with me.
Veganism is on the rise. In the United Kingdom in 2016, surveys showed that just over 1% of the population identified as vegan, and that more than twice that identified as vegetarian. A new 2018 survey claims to have found a huge growth, with 7% of the population identifying as vegan and 14% identifying as vegetarian. We see similar trends in the United States. A recent poll showed 6% of people in the US identified as vegan in 2017, compared to 1% in 2014. Vegan food products have taken over mainstream markets. People can pick up an Impossible Whopper at Burger King or a Beyond Meat sausage patty at Dunkin' Donuts. Plant-based meat substitutes are predicted to make up 1/3 of the entire market for proteins by the year 2054. Plant-based milks are also growing in popularity. The global plant-based milk market is expected to reach $21.5 billion by 2024, up from $7 billion in 2010. What can explain this incredible rise in popularity of veganism and plant-based foods? What does a vegan praxis look like in 2021, and how does it differ from the structure of the movement in the 1990s? How can the sociological imagination help us understand the growth and change in veganism as a social movement over these decades? For the past 22 years, we have collectively conducted in-depth interviews with 169 vegans and have written numerous articles and a book on veganism. We will use this previously collected data to revisit the landscape of vegan studies through the sociological imagination. We will reflect on how veganism went from an alternative social movement on the fringe of society to a popular lifestyle that is inching its way into the mainstream. By revisiting our interviews, which span from 1999 to 2018, we look for what the vegans and vegan animal rights activists we interviewed defined as success, and we compare that to the landscape of veganism today. We explore both past and current divisions within the movement. Finally, we appraise big picture questions about the promise and perils of venture capitalism and mainstreaming veganism. In doing so, we hope to provide a useful path for current vegan activists and vegan sociologists for future research and practice. Revisiting our early interviews, we noticed that our interviewees complained about veganism being inconvenient and difficult. Many of them also spoke about putting on the face of the happy vegan when going out to eat with others to demonstrate that they were happy with their decision to go vegan. In 2002, Roger said that he had to cook everything he ate. The drawbacks are obviously that it's inconvenient, because it's usually a big change in lifestyle, especially if you don't cook. That was easier for me to cook vegan things than to find vegan things in stores. I can't imagine if I wasn't a person who cooked, I can't imagine having to become vegan. I can't imagine relying on other sources for my food because I cook 90% of what I eat. Similarly, Jason said there were no restaurants for him. There's 20 restaurants downtown and I can eat at 3 of them. Other vegans lamented how much they miss cheese. Clearly, this was before the rise of vegan substitutes for meat and dairy products and the arrival of vegan options at restaurants. We were surprised to see the extent to which our interviewees categorized veganism as inconvenient. Perhaps we, as vegan sociologists, were biased and wanted to put a happy face on our vegan interviews and did not realize the extent to which our respondents noted veganism as inconvenient. While we know we cannot make conclusions about what past interviewees would say about current events, the extent to which they lamented veganism as inconvenient makes us think they would be happy with the current state of veganism as convenient and catered to at so many restaurants. Many of our participants also said that their family and friends were angry at them for being vegan and would not accommodate their food needs. Leah in 2012 said, when you decide to be vegan, you choose in some ways to marginalize yourself. There's assumptions about where you stand politically, but there are also assumptions about how you marginalize yourself and don't take part in other things. So you don't get invited to other things as much because there's an assumption you're not going to go along with it. In addition to having people not invite me, I've also cut my social circle down. My partner has a lot of non-vegan friends and I don't like to go to their events. I don't even like to go to my partner's mom's house because I won't have anything to eat there. They also felt anger towards people for not caring about animal rights and realized they had to change how they interacted with non-vegans, especially when trying to promote their cause, as Carrie said. I was kind of a born-again vegan the first couple of years and it didn't go over well. I was so horrified by what I saw and learned. I just couldn't wait to tell everyone else so they would get it too. But what I found out was that most people weren't interested. They didn't want to know how their food got onto their plate. They just didn't want to know. I was simply naive at first. So these vegans said that they worked hard to manage their emotions and their behaviors to act like a happy, helpful vegan rather than an angry activist in order to promote veganism as a desirable lifestyle and identity.
We discovered divisions within the movement between health and ethical vegans that created a hierarchy and raped people's commitment to the cause and authenticity based on the motivations for going vegan. Mark in 2012 stated, if you're a health vegan, you're selfish. I'm not saying it's bad at all. I'm saying you care about your body. If you're an ethical vegan, you care about outside of you. It's not about you or making yourself healthy. It's about being a good person and caring about what happens to other species. Products that are tested on animals, wearing leather, things like that. So there's a big, big difference. Meredith in 2002 said, I'm not a healthy vegan at all, not even a little. So yeah, to me, that's what the difference is. Mine is more of a moral basis, whereas I think most of theirs is the dietary sort of basis. In the interviews conducted between 2016 and 2018, there seemed to be a shift in the thinking about veganism, as more vegans of color adopted veganism and embraced intersectionality. Participants argued that it was important to realize that Black and Latinos turned to veganism for different reasons, including health. Veganism has always been predominantly associated with whiteness, and people of color were hesitant to start eating vegan. They were often scared that vegan food is bland and tasteless. More importantly, food connects people to their cultural traditions. That's why Anthony, a vegan chef, started a business selling soul food from his trailer in the urban center of a food desert. I do a barbecue tofu type thing that people really like. I just want to meet people halfway. A lot of people are like, I'm gonna miss my ribs, I'm gonna miss all my fried fish. And I'm like, no, you can still have it, man, but you just won't be killing anything. And this is somewhat healthier than what you'd normally be eating. Soul food is not something we should eat all the time. I just want to give you an alternative to know that you don't have to eat animals to get that flavor. All the flavor that you get comes from plants. The meat doesn't taste like anything until you season it with the plant. There's an understanding for vegans of color, particularly Black vegans, that the standard American diet is killing their community. So they're turning to culturally appropriate plant-based foods to heal themselves, heal their community, and save animals. The internet is shifting the vegan practice. Vegans can quickly and easily spread information on the benefits of veganism to personal health, the environment, and farmed animals. People can join virtual vegan communities and solely engage in online activism without ever leaving their homes. In short, our networks are spread thin. The original and more radical message is very thin. One can search for plant-based recipes, buy vegan shoes, and discover the latest vegan ice cream through a Google search. Corporations are using the latest technology to fulfill a vegan niche market. Veganism is becoming convenient. Technology is revolutionizing veganism, but what will happen to the revolution? Defeated by the prospect of changing people's behaviors and attitudes, animal rights activists traded the megaphone for the lamp to produce meatless meat. Veganism no longer requires self-control, aestheticism, personal growth, or change. You no longer need to advocate for animals. You could just switch proteins, add plants, and stir. No major adjustments to your life needed. One no longer needs to find community with other vegans. It no longer needs to be an all-encompassing identity. Do Whoppers and Beyond Meat sandwiches truly represent success? Veganism as an ideology emerged as a rejection of using animals for human needs whenever possible. In addition to rejecting carnism and speciesism, vegan sociology rejects capitalism that thrives on the exploitation of human animals and non-human animals. Thus, the new generation of vegan studies must incorporate a sociological imagination that understands how all these exploitations are linked in order to fully create structural change. We therefore call for research that embraces an interdisciplinary, intersectional, and multi-movement that seeks to make a more inclusive veganism. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both. I guess it played okay. We saw, we heard, we learned. That was very excellent. Thank you. By the way, while I'm thinking about it, would you guys mind sending me a PowerPoint to that? I couldn't take notes because the puppy, she was barking. So I had to hold her. Okay, so thanks very much for that. And up next is Christina and Alexandra. Are you with us?
Hi to everyone.
Good morning.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. We would like to thank the AIVS. Can you hear me well, first of all? Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. We would like to thank the AIVS for organizing this important conference. Our presentation is based on research done for the master thesis, Animals and Biopolitical Power at the Attica Zoological Park, completed in 2019 by Christina Vasilopoulou, that's me, with the supervision of Alexandra Halkias, Professor of Sociology. Professor Halkias is with us today at Pantheon University in Athens, Greece. In this picture, we see Jenny, one of the two jaguars living in the Greek zoo, who are shot as they escaped from their cage in December 2018. This is the park which is the focus of our research. Attica Zoological Park is the only zoo in Greece accompanied with several atypical bestiaries. We will refer to the park as AZP or park to what follows. Established in a suburb of Athens, Sparta, the park has been operating as a private enterprise since 2000, and it has 2,000 non-human animals confined on its premises. And in 2019, data from the park suggested it has 75 employees, many volunteers, and hundreds of thousands of visitors. The research included two on-site visits for observation, one focus group discussion with 20 children aged 7 to 11, interviews with 5 teachers and 1 activist, as well as analysis of discourse produced by the zoo, website, pamphlets, etc. Our focus is on the relationships between human and non-human animals as they are defined and confirmed through the operation of the zoo, and as they are articulated and by those we spoke with. Analysis draws from a post-structural theory, ecofeminism, and critical animal studies. Due to today's time constraints, we have chosen just a few aspects of the research to share now, but we would be happy to elaborate if there is a discussion time.
The spectacular representation of the zoo. Foucault, 1989, points out the layout of the space of prison, organization into holding cells, positions, and rows imposes characterizations, evaluations, and hierarchies. In this light, the holding cell itself and the layout of the zoo signifies the animal as inferior. Matthew Krulu analyzes animals as biopolitical subjects within the zoo. 2017 is the study. Through the sciences of biology, psychology, and ethology, animals are subject to an anthropological machine that contributes to the distinction between human and non-human animals. Inside the zoo, there are 3 types of objectification of animals. Human sciences, separation practices, and practices of the self. the animal in the zoo is gradually transformed into a distinct subject with special needs, scientifically recognized as subject to biopolitical care, whereas it used to be objectified as simply bare life in anonymous bodies that are subject to violence. It is this new subjectivity of animals that currently puts them under control, what Iris Braveman calls zooveyance. The Attica Park's French owner, Lesseur, previously engaged in a number of business activities, such as, interestingly, Greek version of Playboy magazine, where he mentions in an interview for the French embassy, he refers to it as a charm magazine that was missing from Greece. In the same interview, he refers to the park as a novelty that Greeks will get used to, while the animals will gradually learn to appropriate the space. This business activity is clearly marked by a colonial discourse, where an educated and civilized Western European comes to civilize the Greek people of Greece in multiple registers, economic, educational, and cultural, and to bring new progressive morals to a backward society. The park materials refer repeatedly to staff as dedicated and on board with the owner's view of its roles in both educating humans, A, and B, conserving non-human species. This echoes colonial rhetoric too. Europeanism of the does not lie only in entrepreneurship and innovation, emerges as a certain moral superiority that aims to teach the love of animals to the uncivilized and zooless, until he arrived, Greeks. All yours, Christina.
Thank you. The park often speaks of its educational dimension as a primary reason for its existence, in what emerges as an effort to hide its spectacular and speculative characters. A number of research findings counter this assertion. During the on-site visits, most of the visitors were families with children and young heterosexual couples who visibly saw the zoo as a sort of amusement park, which is also the legal description of the company on the receipt of the admission tickets. The speculative nature of the park is already evident from the entrance, in this and in many money boxes that aim to extract money from the visitor, for example, to feed the turtles. The families were busy taking souvenir photos and going through as many cages as possible, making mundane comments and sometimes rude exclamations similar to those of a stadium. There was no evidence of interest for the animals' welfare in the confinement conditions and from the visitors observed. Meanwhile, the teachers we talked with explained that the schools treat the visit to the park as a walk in the countryside and as an opportunity for the children to just see the animals. There is no organized pedagogical approach, nor does the park seem to offer educational tours to the schools. While the classification of species was intense in the material and on the signs of the park, according to the teachers, the children did not seem to remember anything new after their visits. Only in the primates were the signs given some importance, as they are considered to be related to the human species. Several children exclaimed, "They're like humans." These findings confirm those of Kuziak 2015 and Ramon 2014. Interestingly, the Zoo of Barcelona that Ramon studied announced its upcoming closure in June 2019, and its dolphins were transported to Athens to the AZP to participate in live performances. Teachers who refused to participate in the visit reported being targeted by colleagues, to the extent of social marginalization through formal and informal procedures, where they were often denied the right to present their arguments. The visit to the AZP and the reaction of colleagues to their refusal to participate result in an experience that has parallels to that of vegan viewing meat in supermarket showcases, which according to James Tanescu, 2012, leads to a social misunderstanding resulting in discrimination and repression, an experience which Chloe Taylor at 2008 finds can lead to melancholy. The feeling of mental loneliness and the categorization of teachers as crazy and dangerous for the children is also an element of dehumanization. The person who defends the animals herself falls into the animal state, losing the rational element seen as inherent in humanity.
The edibility norm. Another interesting finding of our study centers on how meat figures in the visit to the park, basically as a served meal in its cafeteria and in the interviewees' narratives of the visit. All the day dishes in the zoo cafe contained meat, which confirms the research of Brando and Hartfield, 2014. At AZP2, through the visit to the zoo, the animal is reconstructed as edible, something confirmed by the reactions of the visitors we observed. Carol Adams, 1991, characterizes the construction of animals as edible bodies as a process through which the animal, as absent, disappears consciousness and is forgotten as an independent entity. This de-individualization of non-human animals is twofold in the AZP. Visitors come to the park first to consume the animal as a spectacle, and then the animal as food. For example, at AZP, visitors were observed treating the adult boars as disgusting. However, their babies are admired by the human mother and her children, while the father then reminds them they are just food, articulating with a gendered nationality, meat eating is marked, as I argue in 2004, as almost normative for Greek masculinity and specific Greek hunter consciousness narrative. Similar sentiment was evident in the young children of our focus group, where the male scouts, when asked by Christina if they saw animals recently, quickly answered, yes, yes, hot dogs, burgers, meat.
Okay. In November 2018, the AZP made news nationwide with the killing of the 2 jaguars held there. In this incident, we saw the impressive transformation of these animals from harmless spectacle to dangerous creatures. Also, the rhetoric of the owner towards the news media evinced elements of prison terminology, with repeated use of the expression escape and reference to how we put them down for the shot. Strong reactions and demonstration followed outside the AZP and in the center of Athens, while according to the teachers we talked with, many students who had visited AZP seemed sad and angry. For activists, the mourning for the jaguars united them. On December 26, 2018, the largest demonstration to date took place outside the AZP. Violence occurred between the protesters and the guards of the area, while the police also intervened. The killing of the jaguars were seen as an opportunity for more people to adopt a stance previously seen as hypersensitivity and social ignorance. It was very clear that the confinement of endangered species in zoos does not guarantee the species survival, while neither are the well-being and longevity of individual members of species accomplished. The shooting of the jaguars at AZP was seen as underlining how an animal in the zoo is a form of property that is constantly subject to the biopolitical control of the owner and of the employees. To conclude, in alignment with studies on various zoos around the globe, we found the AZP to be a site of social learning of the dominant ideas of anthropocentrism, which is naturalized and reproduces through its confinement and commercial exploitation of animals. In addition, dominant ideas of colonialism and of the biopolitical management of the populations are reproduced at the site of the Attica Zoological Park in Athens. thus also perpetuating the divide between nature and culture. We have our contact information and the bibliography. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, it's a bit upsetting. Actually, I'd like to start off the Q&A if you guys don't mind. I've been collecting them. As I'm asking, if people want to go ahead and ask some more questions in the chat, and I'll relay them back. But this is for Christina and Alexandra. So I was really interested to learn a little bit more about the situation in Greece, because when you talk about this carceral kind of symbolism, this kind of normalization of prison and everyday life in this way, that as an American, of course, speaks to me, because the US, of course, has the largest per capita prison population. But I was very interested in what's the situation in Greece. And also we have the fact that that zoos, of course, have been reimagined in the past few decades as learning, as you pointed out, learning spaces and educational and conservationist, which this is all just greenwashing spin that's been put on recently. But underneath the surface, as you point out, is very clear prison symbolism that's within that. So what's the negotiation there, and how is that unique in what's happening in Greece? And of course, Greece is also having to grapple with the reality of climate change with all the fires that have just happened. So maybe you could share a little bit more about Greek culture and how that relates to your study.
Wow, thank you, Corey. That is a huge question, however. Greek culture and its various facets. I guess I'll take a quick stab first, and then maybe Christina can add in that. I would focus specifically on the present historical moment, just as a way to give a first answer to that really interesting question. In terms of Greece's situation in the migrant crisis during the last few years, so that a lot of the public discourse and circulation concerns the basically holding site for migrants. I'm sure all of you have familiar with the flow that has been coming through the Aegean, especially in 2015 and 16, but continues to be a main concern in Greece. So in terms of carceral symbolism or practices that have a certain resonance with surveillance in a prison context, what is in the foreground right now is more how Greece is attempting to be very, putting forward a very humanitarian face, very civilized, maximally civilized, in handling for Europe, almost as though, Greece is being handmade for Europe to handle this flow of the potentially dangerous, potentially animal in a certain way, human bodies of the migrants. So I think that aspect of the present historical moment sort of is where we see discourses relating to prison practices, trying to negotiate at the same time with this notion of being civilized and the obligation on the part of Greece to sort of put forward a maximally humane persona, if we use that word for a nation. So the zoo operating in the shadow of this, I think that would be an important thing to keep in our mind. Christina, do you want to jump in with some other aspect here?
I think that what makes a zoo seen as a prison for the visitors, it's also the landscape of the zoo. We didn't mention it is from the things that we cut off, but the zoo, it is established like a prison. It is a small place. There are several cages. The animals are restrained, and it has also a cycle. way. It is established in a circle way, so it's closed from outside, and the visitors come around on the inside. So and the offices of Lesueur, they are in the middle, so it has also a panopticon architecture as we see it. I think that, and what Professor Halkias talked about, the immigrants and the notion of many Greeks that we have to put them on jails or outside the cities, etc. This is a great discussion of today, and what the state want to do to the immigrants.
Mhm. In public discourse too, we see certain similarity in the way migrant bodies are represented as being, at least in the beginning, now discourse has settled, as being potentially threats to hygiene concerns. And this is very similar to a discourse about animals, often observed in Greece, especially in terms of stray animals. So the zoo is sort of a counterpoint stray figure of the animal.
Thanks for that. I think it's really important to highlight this push back on this narrative of zoos being spaces for just humane education or conservation, where in fact there's a whole bigger colonial kind of story that's behind the scenes. And I'm really glad to see this research, because it's really frustrating. I know as a vegan sociologist, the real lessons people are learning when they visit these establishments. But unfortunately, in the literature, most of just about everything I've seen talks about how people go there and they learn about the animals and they feel more environmentally interested and have more compassion. It's like, actually, what are they learning? They're learning to be complacent with a prison culture. They're learning to be complacent with the ramifications of colonialism. I'll leave it there. If anyone else has any, this super fascinating topic. If anyone has any other questions on this, I'm going to pop back over to one of the other panelists now. How about Roger asked a while back for Nick. He says, thanks for your talk on beyond the individual and perhaps the power of psychology in the animal advocacy movement. Do you think this focus on the individual goes some way to explain why veganism is often or frequently mistaken as a diet?
Yeah, I think and this definitely isn't my point, but definitely Roger and I believe Corey as well have spoken about the way in which the movement is so based around psychology more than sociology, and that is, I think, is both a reflection of this individual focus and kind of looking at just like a sort of an individual moral failing of eating animals, which is, again, not to say that we should neglect individual change, but definitely Lindsay Kramer's talk from yesterday talking about Bordeaux's work on capital and how it is easier for some people to go vegan, stay vegan, than for others. Kind of overlooks those kind of issues and sort of points us down this very individualistic focus road. And I think it also does feed into the idea of veganism, just like an individual dietary choice. And we often hear that idea of like, oh, well, you can eat whatever you like it's an individual choice. And yeah, even though as vegans, we sort of politicize those individual choices, I think, I think having purely individual messaging can kind of feed into that idea, which does seem to be quite common.
I can actually follow up on that and ask Liz and Jessica to jump in here, because now we have some evidence of how there's been major changes over the past 2 decades, and they very rightfully focus on some of the structural changes. So maybe Liz or Jessica, do you want to kind of flesh out what Nick was saying there?
Yeah, it actually made me think of something a little bit different. In my environmental sociology class, I just presented some data when we were moving into, how does the state figure into all of this? And there was a comparative survey of people in like 15 different wealthy nations. And the United States was #1 in terms of being, the worst to the environment, combined with people who felt the least guilty about it, but who felt the most like individual actions could matter. It was just, you know, bootstrap mentality in one perfect survey. So, you know, I loved what Nick was saying about, you know, maybe we need to focus more on the structural issues, you know, looking back. This would be another cool, you know, study, just looking back at the extent to which vegan activism was individualized. You know, just thinking back to the slogans of even, you know, groups like Vegan Outreach. You know, what, sorry, now I'm feeling the early effects. I can't finish the sentence, but even if you like meat, that was it, you know, just here are some individual steps that you can take. So yeah, I think that we would see this. Yeah, Jessica.
I also hear on the other side is if it's a structural issue, there's something I can do about it. And so I'm just going to keep on chowing down on my burgers. So there's the flip side of that. And how do we as sociologists merge that? Well, yeah, we could do this. I mean, Nick, I heard you talking about this a little bit, but I just don't see that flying as much. It's something that we should think structurally about, and individuals should partake in it, but it's really a structural issue. So I don't know.
I think as sociologists looking at any kind of social change issue, like I know like gender comes to mind. Like I don't think it's a matter of like devaluing those individual transformations in terms of rethinking gender and gender norms and gender roles. Like that definitely is important. But to address gender inequality, we can't just have that individual change. We also need to look at what policies are feeding into this. How does capitalism feed into all these kind of broader issues as well? So I think it's kind of the same with animal advocacy, not to say like, don't bother, it's structural, so don't even bother changing yourself at all, but not purely relying on that individual change, I guess.
So maybe now I would like to highlight as well this bit on capitalism, that the venture vegan capitalist bit there. I mean, this is something that it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? But I think that maybe, if anyone disagrees here, but I would say that a lot of us, what makes us sociologists is that we have a good, strong critique of the capitalist system. So maybe if you all would like to comment a little bit further on that for maybe those who aren't familiar with that position.
Was that directed to someone in particular or just anyone?
Nope, just the group who are speaking now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in with that. I guess just one example of that is, which again isn't anything new from me specifically, but Lindsay Kramer mentioned this again in the talk yesterday, and I've heard it raised before, of like the issue of food deserts, which I've heard of a lot of research, which is, you know, a lot of the research I've seen is quite US centric on that, but definitely is an issue elsewhere as well. But that idea that capitalism creates economic inequalities and class inequality, and therefore it's going to be very difficult for those communities, often poorer communities, often communities of color, et cetera, who are disadvantaged in a capitalist system, to actually have the ability to choose vegan options in terms of having access to healthy food, fresh foods, rather than just like chain fast food restaurants which don't have many vegan options. So I guess that'd just be one connection between capitalism and animal exploitation.
Liz or Jessica, did you want to elaborate on that? There we go.
You go first.
Well, I was gonna just say Jessica was the one who had come up with this critique of vegan venture capitalism, but the idea you know, sort of came out of the entire purpose of why we wanted to revisit everything. Like, is this the success we were looking for? And, you know, we saw the comments in the chat afterwards, and it sounds like a lot of people, you know, including us, I have been saved by an Impossible Whopper at Burger King. You know, it was the only place that I could go. And, you know, it is that double-edged sword, like you were saying, where, you know, Jessica had the comment of just add plants and stir. So it seems to be taking away some of the original, you know, structural and political critique. So maybe
Yeah.
I'll throw it to Jess.
Yeah, and I think about how with capitalism, I mean, the treatment of animals, treatment of human workers, right? I don't know, are these workers creating this impossible burger? Are they unionized? You know, what are their working conditions like? I have no idea. Are we even going to question those issues? And so I just feel like if it's just something that you just eat something different, a new protein, are we thinking in that vegan sociological way? Are we thinking about this on larger scales?
We had a presentation yesterday from someone who's doing their dissertation on, I guess, this topic exactly.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was such a great connection.
I asked her, I said, well, do you know anything about the labor rights issues? Because I know in the nonprofit sector and animal advocacy, of course, that's been exploding. There's been
Terrible. Yeah.
So one would suspect that as these major corporations buy up these once small local community-based or grassroots politically oriented, something's going to be going down for sure. And of course, Breeze Harper has very famously advocated this notion of cruelty-free being shaky ground when we're talking about even just fruits and vegetables. Who's growing our fruits and vegetables, oftentimes really exploited immigrant labor. I think I'll jump over to another panelist now because we have a couple questions for Donelle. Donelle, if you're ready for one. Linda has asked, how difficult was it to access willing participants? Because my understanding is that for many, I guess, vegan veteran, whatever VVP is, vegan veterinarian practitioners, it's a very difficult experience. So how did you find them and persuade them to participate? By that, I mean, difficult to be vegan within the veterinary establishment. Yeah, how'd you manage that?
Thank you. Great question. My greatest concern with this project was accessing participants, and that was for two reasons. Primarily because I had a career myself as a veterinary nurse for 25 years and came across, I think, 2 other vegans in that time. So I wasn't sure how many there were. And to do a PhD project on a group of which you have no idea how many of those, how many exist. And then secondly, how to access them was the second issue. So I didn't know how many there were and if there would be enough to even, justify a project this large. And then accessing them also, I wondered if, as I hypothesized, I guess, or as I anticipated, there was irreconcilability between many aspects of the role and vegan ideology that many may have left the profession. I myself had left. So how would I find those people? And yeah, so going into it, I really didn't know. I had a plan to source participants through a Facebook page, Vegan Veterinary Network Facebook page. That was my best off the line attempt to get participants. It wasn't very successful. And I think partly because that group was also open to friends, family and supporters of vegans. So even though it had a large database of numbers, they weren't all vegan veterinary professionals. So I also was concerned about them writing back to me on a post that I had put on there because of confidentiality issues, even though I was directing them to private message me. So in the end, social media wasn't my friend in that instance, although it did result in some participants. But I found canvassing the veterinary hospitals through email was the easiest way to do it. So writing a kind of vague, and it is in the thesis, this kind of vague, generic, I'm doing research, do you have any vegans that work there? Can they contact me directly? And I was actually surprised because I used to work as what I would call a veterinary gatekeeper. And as a receptionist in the veterinary hospital, often a lot of emails aren't related to clients wanting something, don't get even through to the people out back doing the work, so to speak. But actually, a lot of them went through, and a lot of receptionists or a lot of veterinary nurses working on email, putting those through to staff with whom they work, who were vegan and often vegetarian. I don't know, and I would love to know how many vegetarians work in the veterinary profession, but many of the vegans that I spoke to worked with vegetarians. Did I say veterinarians or vegetarians there? Vegetarians. So I think collectively vegans, vegetarians would be a much larger population than just vegans, but they're certainly there. I didn't have any trouble getting access to them through contacting the veterinary practices, and the second best technique was snowball. So a lot of vegan veterinary professionals know other vegan veterinary professionals, and there was that rapport built already, so that conduit there to increase the numbers. The reason I stopped at 20 was because I felt I was getting saturation around 17, 18, 19, 20, but the same basic challenges were coming up. So, you know, at some point in a PhD, you do have to draw the line. So I had actually received double the number of people. So the people I included were 20. I actually had 40 plus people who I was communicating with. I was looking in the UK, but I didn't end up interviewing any participants from outside of England. So none from the UK, none from Ireland, although I had talked to some there about an interview. For various reasons, those interviews didn't come to fruition, but I definitely could have had they gone ahead for whatever reason they didn't. I had double the numbers. But a lot of the people who did reply were ruled out upon the basis that they either weren't formally qualified, and I was looking for people who were formally qualified because they had gone through the training process, and I was interested in, say, their experiences of visiting slaughterhouses or their experiences of having to do mandatory dissection, that kind of thing. And also there were lots of, I guess, a lot of people who were vegan, and even though I had put in there that I wanted them to be vegan primarily for animals, so sort of political reasons, upon speaking to them, they were either flexitarian, vegetarian, or they were kind of equally health or equally environmental. And I was looking for people who had quite strong alignment with what I was trying to access in terms of people being having beliefs in line with that kind of original radical concept of veganism. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. It wasn't as hard as I had thought, and I'm very grateful that they spoke to me.
Yeah, thanks. Like it's really useful to hear some of the methodological behind the scenes stuff, because I just did a study earlier this year and I thought it'd be easy enough. I just needed to get people to interview about activism, but I used social media and it was a complete dead end. I couldn't get anything. The only thing I got was from Twitter, because other academic friends who are on Twitter, and that's the only reason. I wasn't getting like your average activist. So it was a lot of snowballing. Yeah, thanks for that. I have another question for you, not on methodology, but on results. Let's see where I lost it. Did any of your participants who talked about issues about recommending animal-based diets to owners recommend plant-based diets? Were there any reflections on feeding plant-based diets to companion animals? So I don't know if you were here yesterday for day one. We had a really contentious talk about the appropriateness of plant-based diets for other animals, and a big debate in the chat. So what did you find from vets?
So mixed results. So a couple of them were strong advocates for plant-based diets for all companion species, even obligate carnivores, and thought that balanced, nutritious diets could be fed to even obligate carnivore species, cats, ferrets, etc. One participant was a very strong advocate for the raw meat diet, and actually pointed out how that often drew reactions of confusion from other people, because being vegan herself and then advocating meat for animals, she found perplexed other people. Majority fit into a couple of other areas. So others that desperately believed in and wanted to be able to promote and use plant-based diets for companion animals, but who felt that there was a lack of evidence-based research at this point to make them comfortable enough to be able to do it. So one of the recommendations that have come out of the thesis is that the veterinary profession looks into, the research into these areas, although some of the vegan veterinary professionals believe that research and that evidence was already there in terms of producing synthetic taurine and making these diets balanced for all companion species. Others felt like they held back because the evidence wasn't there, but also they themselves didn't feel that they had enough nutritional training or knowledge about plant-based diets for companion animals. And another recommendation that has come out of the thesis is recommending that more veterinary training focuses in the nutrition aspect of their course on viability and opportunities and availability of plant-based alternatives out of necessity for the reasons we all know. So for the planet, some would argue it would be a better health option for companion animals, and indeed some of my participants believe that, and obviously for the reasons of climate change and moving to a plant-based food system. So I felt that a couple of them, even though they were people who wanted to use plant-based diets and who believed that they could be used, anticipated resistance within the profession. So I think only one participant openly sort of said, oh yes, if I wanted to, promote plant-based diets to my clients, I could, and my boss or my employers would have no problem with that. Others felt that there would be resistance to that. They didn't really say why, but I would suggest it was because of the lack of evidence, although I wonder if it might also be the kind of stigmas, this idea that you could have a vegan pet and that somehow is projecting or forcing an ideology onto a companion species. So that's why I call them plant-based diets, not vegan diets for pets, because, the interest isn't making the pet vegan. The interest is feeding a plant-based food that's fully balanced and nutritious to companion animal. So their thoughts on that were really interesting, quite broad, and I felt like a lot of them felt like they lacked the knowledge. A lot of them had a lot of hope that things could change. Very interesting point that came up before about the no meat options, in vitro meat, as a way that might actually solve this problem for vegan veterinary professionals. I know there are some mouse treats now that have come out that are made from cultured meat from mice. And as you were talking before, like, is that really a solution to this problem? And I hadn't actually dug that deep down. So that's somewhere I will go now to think about that. My participants hadn't, but I think they are hopeful that things can change. They also pointed out that there already is a balanced plant-based diet for pets, which I think they referred to hypoallergenic. So a particular diet that's already made from plant-based ingredients that's fully nutritionally balanced for companion animals. And yeah, I think there's a lot of hope within the vegan veterinary community that plant-based diets for companion species is a way forward and something that we can actually change. And some mentioned that change will be driven by public demand. So as more vegans, or if more vegans increase in the community, or if plant-based diets become more accepted in human diets, then it may be a natural progression that people start asking their vets, is that an option for their companion species as well? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's a surge in India now for vegetarian dog foods that they're working to develop. So yeah, that's only going to be more and more normal. I mean, even here in Canterbury, I could just walk down into the city center and they sell vegan dog food, and it's whereas back in the day you had to go online and order it and wait 5 weeks for it to come and all that mess. I guess we're running short on time here. The panel has come to an end. My dog desperately needs to go out and use the bathroom, so I'm going to shut it down now. If anyone wants to save the chat, now's the time to do it. Let me push stop record.